I wasn't supposed to feel anything that night. That was the whole point of going alone. It was a Tuesday in October, the kind of Kansas City evening where the rain comes down sideways and the streets smell like wet leaves and something burning somewhere far off. I had spent 11 hours staring at Hall stress calculations, and my eyes felt like sandpaper. So when my assistant mentioned the ceramic exhibition at Nelson Atkins, I said, sure, why not? And drove over mostly to prove I still had a life outside the drafting table. The museum was half empty. I moved through the first 2 rooms without stopping, hands in my coat pockets, doing the polite nod and keep walking routine that isn't really looking at art at all. Then I hit the 3rd room and stopped cold. It was a vase. Old, pale, shattered once and rebuilt with gold filling every crack. The kind of repair that doesn't hide the damage, but turns it into the whole story. I stood there longer than I meant to. It's the gold that gets you, a voice said beside me. I turned. She was standing close enough that I should have noticed her sooner. Blonde hair loosely pinned, brown eyes that were still fixed on the vase like I hadn't spoken yet. She was maybe my height but softer somehow. The kind of calm that isn't passive, it's practiced. The break is still there, I said. She just stopped apologizing for it. She looked at me then. She repeated, like that choice of word meant something. Her name was Valerie. She restored ceramics for a living, which explained the way she looked at broken things like they were worth saving. I told her I designed rowing hulls, which she found genuinely interesting in a way most people fake. We drifted toward the wine table and stayed there through the rest of the exhibition without touching either glass. She talked slowly and meant every word. I am not usually a woman who notices that. I noticed it. When the lights dimmed for closing, she pulled a plain white card from her jacket pocket and held it out without ceremony. In case the vase keeps bothering you, she said. I took it. She walked out first, coat collar up against the rain, and didn't look back. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before I drove home. The card flat on the passenger seat, her name facing up. Valerie Perry. No title, no tagline. Just a name and a number, like she already knew that was enough. I called 3 days later. I opened with something about kintsugi technique that I had looked up specifically to sound knowledgeable, and she laughed before I finished the sentence, a real laugh, not polite. You researched me, she said. I researched the art form. Sure you did. We made plans for coffee. Nothing was said out loud about what we were actually making plans for. But I think we both knew, the same way you know a hull design is right before you run a single calculation. Something in the proportions just sits correctly. You feel it before you can prove it. I drove home that night thinking about a cracked vase and a woman who looked at damage like it was the most interesting part of the story. I thought about her until I fell asleep at my drafting table with my pencil still in my hand, which had not happened in a very long time. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 mugs in front of her, steam rising from both. I hadn't told her what I drank. She had guessed anyway, and gotten it exactly right. Black with 1 sugar, which is not an obvious guess. I sat down across from her and looked at the mug and then at her. Lucky guess, she said, before I could ask. That happened to you often? Only with people worth paying attention to. I wrapped both hands around the mug and decided right then that Valerie Perry was going to be a problem for me in the best possible way. We stayed at that table on 39th Street for 2.5 hours. The cafe turned over twice around us, and we barely noticed. She told me about a 17th century Ming bowl she had spent 4 months restoring, how the original maker's thumb impression was still visible in the clay near the base, how she worked around it like it was sacred. I told her about hull flex ratios and how a design that looks perfect on paper can still fail the moment real water gets under it. We were talking about completely different things, and somehow the same thing entirely. The autumn light moved across the table between us, as the morning ran long into midday. The following Thursday, she invited me to her studio in the Crossroads district, a wide, low-ceilinged space that smelled like mineral dust and something faintly sweet. Shelves lined every wall, holding fragments and half-restored pieces, tagged with small paper labels in her handwriting. It was orderly in the way that only deeply patient people manage. I walked slowly through the room while she pulled on a work apron, and I kept stopping to look at things. A cracked blue plate held together with thin gold lines. A bowl with a missing section she had rebuilt from matching clay. A small figurine with one repaired hand raised. "You fix things nobody else would bother with," I said. "Somebody made them," she said simply. "That counts for something." I turned to say something back and found her already watching me from across the work table. She had a restoration sketch open in front of her, and her pencil was resting on the paper, but she wasn't looking at either. She was looking at me with those brown eyes that held absolutely no apology for looking. I walked over. We leaned over the sketch together, shoulders almost touching, and she walked me through the repair plan in a low, steady voice. The rain started up outside, tapping the high studio windows. I was listening to maybe half of what she was actually saying. At some point, she turned her head, and I turned mine, and we were suddenly much closer than the sketch required. The room went very quiet except for the rain. "Some things are only beautiful because they broke first," she said, just above a whisper. I looked at her for a long moment. Everything in me moved toward her. I felt it clearly, like a tide making a decision, but I stepped back instead, slow and deliberate, and told her I should go, and she nodded once and let me, and neither of us pretended that was an ending. I drove home with the rain hard on the windshield and my hands steady on the wheel and my whole chest full of something I hadn't budgeted for when I walked into a museum on a Tuesday night looking at a broken vase. Dana found me staring at the same hull section for 40 minutes on a Wednesday morning and put a coffee on my desk hard enough to slap. "The Mercer contract," she said. 3 weeks, Nora. That's all we have." She was right, and I knew it. 2 years of firm revenue sitting on one revised design, and I had spent the better part of a week thinking about a woman's hands moving over a broken bowl. Dana gave me the look she reserves for situations she considers self-inflicted, which is the worst kind of her looks, because she is usually correct. I doubled down on the work. I stopped answering my phone after 9. I left Valerie's last 3 texts on read without meaning to let a day pass, and then 2 days passed, and then it was easier to keep not answering than to explain the silence. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things that week. She showed up on a Thursday evening, without warning. I heard the outer door of the drafting office open and looked up expecting Dana. And it was Valerie, standing in the doorway in her coat with a paper takeout bag in one hand and absolutely no apology on her face. "I don't do silence well," she said. I set my pencil down. Something in my chest that had been pulled tight for days just released all at once. I looked at her across the wide drafting table. This woman who showed up with food instead of an ultimatum, who stated her terms plainly and without drama. And I felt something I hadn't let myself feel since the studio, since the rain on the windows, since I stepped back when everything in me said don't. I walked around the table slowly. When I reached her, I raised my hands and held her face gently, and I kissed her the way I had been not kissing her for 3 weeks. It was slow and certain, and neither of us moved for a long moment after it began. She tasted like cold air and something warm underneath it, and the kiss settled into something that felt less like a beginning and more like a return. When we finally pulled apart, she kept her eyes closed for just a second longer than I did. The blueprints stayed exactly where they were for the rest of the night. 3 weeks later, she was helping me tear up warped floorboards in the old Craftsman house on Gillum Road, the one my Aunt Margaret left me, which I had been putting off dealing with for months. We had the back bedroom half dismantled when Valerie's crowbar caught on something behind the built-in bookcase along the north wall. We pulled the bookcase out together and found a narrow door behind it, painted over 4 or 5 times, sealed from the outside with a flat iron latch. I stood there looking at it for a moment. The house was very quiet. "Did you know this was here?" Valerie asked. "No," I said, and my voice came out strange. I worked the latch open. The door swung inward on a small windowless room, dry and still, perfectly preserved. Shelves on 3 walls held stacked leather journals. A wooden crate on the floor held faded photographs bundled with twine. In the corner, an iron box with a keyhole, locked. I picked up the first photograph. My Aunt Margaret, younger than I had ever seen her, standing close beside a woman I didn't recognize. Then another, and another. Women together across what looked like decades, the clothes changing but the closeness staying constant. Valerie crouched beside me and looked at the photographs without speaking. The room smelled like old paper and cedar, and something held for a very long time. Neither of us said a word for a full minute. We just knelt there on the bare floorboards while the house kept all its secrets one breath longer before giving them up. We carried the journals to the kitchen table, and I opened the first one under the overhead light, while Valerie made tea without being asked. Margaret's handwriting was small and slanted, the kind of handwriting that learned to take up less space on purpose. The entries started in 1974. By the 3rd page I had a name, Ruth. By the 10th page I understood everything. They had met at a pottery class in the Crossroads district, which made Valerie set her mug down slowly and say nothing for a moment. Ruth was a ceramic artist. Margaret had loved her for 40 years, documented every season of it in these journals, the joy of early years, and the grinding weight of hiding it, and the decade of silence after Ruth moved away under pressure from her family. The last journal entry was dated 6 months before Margaret died. It did not mention Ruth by name. It just said some doors you don't walk through, and you spend the rest of your life standing in the hallway. I found the key for the iron box tucked inside the back cover of the final journal. Inside the box was a small ceramic pendant, pale with a single hairline crack sealed in gold, and beneath it a folded letter addressed to Ruth in Margaret's hand. Never sealed. Never sent. I read it aloud to Valerie at the kitchen table. My voice held through the first half. It did not hold through the second. The days after that were harder than I expected. I told myself I was processing someone else's story, which was technically true and completely dishonest. I started going quiet again, not toward work this time but inward, in a way that had no clean explanation. Valerie sent a message on the 3rd day. 1 line, "I'm here when you come back." I read it 4 times and did not reply until evening. She gave me space. Then on a Sunday afternoon, she left a voicemail, short and unhurried, that said she understood grief that wasn't straightforward, that she wasn't going anywhere, and that she had found something I needed to know about. I listened to it 4 times before I called her back. She came over that evening and told me across the kitchen table, steady and direct, that she had found Ruth, 73 years old, living alone in Lawrence, Kansas. Valerie had a ceramics colleague who knew her through restoration circles and had reached out quietly to confirm she was the same Ruth from the journals. I felt the floor shift under me, and not in a good way. "You went looking," I said. "I did. That wasn't your call to make." "Maybe not." She didn't flinch. "But you were disappearing again, and I wasn't going to watch that happen over something that could still be repaired." The argument that followed was quiet and surgical, the kind that lands harder than raised voices because every word is deliberate. I told her she crossed the line. She told me I used distance the way other people use locked doors. Neither of us was entirely wrong, and we both knew it. The night ended without resolution. She gathered her coat in the hallway, and I stood in the doorway saying nothing useful, and then without thinking, I reached out and caught her wrist gently before she stepped off the porch. The apology I tried to form came out as silence, so instead I pulled her close and pressed my lips to her forehead, slow and sorry, holding her there in the cold dark, while the November air sat heavy around us. She exhaled against me and didn't pull away. We stayed like that for a long moment, her breath warm against my collarbone, before she finally stepped back and walked to her car. I stood on the porch until her taillights disappeared, and then went back inside to the kitchen table, where Margaret's unsent letter was still sitting open under the light. I drove to Lawrence alone on a gray Tuesday morning, with Margaret's unsent letter in my coat pocket and the ceramic pendant wrapped in a cloth on the passenger seat where Valerie's card had sat 2 months earlier. The drive took 40 minutes. I spent most of it not thinking about what I was going to say. Ruth answered the door before I knocked twice. She was small and sharp-eyed, white hair cut close, the kind of woman who had decided a long time ago to take up exactly as much space as she needed and not 1 inch less. Her kitchen smelled like tea and old wood and something faintly mineral, like clay dust that had settled into the walls over decades. She put the kettle on without asking and told me to sit. I gave her the letter first. She held it in both hands for a long moment without opening it, turning it over once, looking at Margaret's handwriting on the front. Then she set it carefully on the table beside her mug and looked at me. She kept everything, Ruth said. It wasn't a question. 4 journals. 40 years. Ruth nodded slowly. Like this confirmed something she had always suspected, but never let herself believe entirely. She asked me about the house, about the hidden room, about the pendant. I answered everything. Then she told me something that no journal had recorded, something Margaret had apparently kept even from her own pages. The year before Ruth left Kansas City, Margaret had made a plan. She had drawn it up the way Nora approached a hull design, methodically, completely, with every contingency considered. She was going to choose Ruth openly, leave behind the half-life she had been living, and say out loud what was true. She had the bags packed the night before. She had a note written, and then she lost her nerve before dawn and unpacked everything and never mentioned it again. Ruth said it without bitterness. That was the part that broke me open completely. 40 years of carrying that information without bitterness. I drove back to Kansas City and sat in my drafting studio until the light went flat and gray outside the windows. The hull design was finished. Dana had gotten her revised drawings. The client call had gone clean. The contract was signed and secure. Everything I had stacked work against for weeks was resolved and settled, and it meant absolutely nothing sitting in that dark room thinking about a woman who packed her bags and then unpacked them before anyone else woke up. I picked up Valerie's original card from my desk drawer, where I had kept it since the first night. I held it under the lamp for a while. Then I called her. We met at the house on Gillum Road, which felt right in a way I couldn't fully explain. She arrived already tense, holding her coat closed at the collar, and the conversation started carefully and then stopped being careful fast. She told me plainly she was tired of the cycle. Tired of being held close and then left in hallways. Tired of being patient with a woman who clearly wanted something she kept talking herself out of. I didn't defend myself. I told her about Ruth, about the bags packed before dawn, about unpacking them alone while someone slept down the hall who would have chosen differently. I told her I was not going to become that story. The room went completely still. Outside the window, the November trees were bare, and the sky was the color of old pewter, and everything was very quiet. Valerie looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, and neither of us moved or spoke for what felt like a long time. It wasn't a kiss. It was something that landed deeper than a kiss right then. The simple weight of her hand saying, "I'm not going anywhere," and meaning every word of it. The new hull design had a small intentional asymmetry pressed into the port side, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Dana noticed it on the final blueprint and circled it with a red pencil and left it on my desk with a question mark. I left her question mark exactly where it was. Valerie came by the studio that afternoon, and I showed her the design and explained the asymmetry without explaining it, and she looked at me for a moment and then laughed softly and kissed me first, which was a reversal that neither of us missed and both of us needed. We drove to Lawrence together on a Sunday in late November to return the pendant to Ruth. The trees along the highway were stripped completely bare, the sky hard and blue and very cold, the kind of late autumn day that feels like the year finally admitting what it is. Ruth was expecting us. She opened the door before we reached the porch. She held the pendant for a long time at her kitchen table, the same way she had held the letter, turning it slowly in her hands, her thumb moving over the gold-sealed crack. Then she looked at both of us sitting across from her and told us to keep it. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not entirely. On the drive back, Valerie turned the pendant over and over in her hands and said quietly that the crack was what made it worth looking at. I pulled the car over on a 2-lane county road with nothing on either side but bare fields and cold sky. I turned to her in the passenger seat and held her face the way I had the first time in the drafting office. The kiss was longer this time, unhurried and complete, with nowhere else to be and nothing left to talk ourselves out of. When we separated, I was already smiling before I opened my eyes. That should have been the end that held. 2 weeks later, Ruth called me. Her voice was different on the phone, slower, and she told me without preamble that she had been diagnosed the previous spring and had not told anyone because there was no one to tell. She said it the same way she said everything, without asking for anything. I sat down on the kitchen floor of the house on Gillam Road and stayed there for a while after we hung up. She passed in January, quietly, in the same small house that smelled like tea and old wood and mineral dust. She left the pendant to Valerie in a note that was 3 sentences long. I found out she had also kept every letter Margaret ever sent her, the ones from before the silence, bundled in a box under her bed with a piece of ribbon around them that had gone brittle with age. I stood at the graveside in Lawrence on a Tuesday morning with Valerie beside me and Dana a few steps back, and I thought about 2 women who loved each other across 40 years and 1 packed bag and 1 unpacked bag and a letter that was never sealed and never sent. I thought about all the hallways people stand in their whole lives waiting for a door they never open. Valerie took my hand at the graveside and held it without looking at me. The pendant was around her neck, the crack catching the thin winter light. I held her hand and looked at the gray Kansas sky and felt the particular weight of a love story that ended too late for the people who lived it, and the particular grace of standing next to someone you chose before you ran out of time. The pendant stayed around Valerie's neck every day after that. Neither of us ever talked about putting it away.